Yeah, I look after government relations in Europe, Middle East and Africa for Discovery. Just without going into our corporate structure too far, we have our global headquarters, everything outside North America is in London, and then we have around 10 sub-offices around Europe. Some of those we have local licenses, some are licensed via Ofcom or the CSA in Paris for Eurosport. Just so we can move forward and talk about some of the issues facing the media sector rather than speculate all morning about who's going to be in government when, I think that this is my kind of working assumption for what's going to happen in London. Obviously, if any of you get updates on your smartphones during this presentation, feel free to interrupt. But clearly, the numbers don't really allow for any other alternative government than a minority Conservative government with support from the Democratic Unionist Party in Northern Ireland. For those of you not from our islands, the DUP was famously founded by Dr. Ian Paisley. So it's not maybe not an easy coalition partner for anybody.
On point of accuracy, the doctor was honorary and never earned.
Okay, very good. But I've got it right, it was his party, right? Yeah, yeah, and his son is still active in the DUP as a member in Westminster. So the numbers seem to suggest that there will be some form of Conservative administration with the backing of the DUP. Historically, there's some alignment between the Conservatives in Great Britain and the Unionists in Northern Ireland. I'm speculating here that the current triumvirate in charge of Brexit, Theresa May, Boris Johnson, the Foreign Secretary, and David Davis, the Secretary for Brexit, will remain in charge. There is, as you can imagine, fevered newspaper speculation about whether Theresa May will resign at some stage. Frankly, if she were to resign and be replaced by somebody else, they'd have the same problem she'd had for the previous year, which is they'd never actually won an electoral mandate themselves. So I think she will kind of stagger on for a while and at least launch the Article 50 negotiations, the talks with the European Union. Messaging from both the Commission and Donald Tusk this morning has been commendably consistent, that the UK is welcome to start talks whenever it likes, but it will be finishing them on March 2019. So the longer it takes us in London or the government in London to get their act together to unscramble their Brexit, the shorter the period of negotiation left for them. And the plan had been that talks would begin in 10 days on June 19th. We'll see. One other obvious bit of speculation is that if we are indeed looking at a government which is dependent on Democratic Unionist Party support, then the issue of Ireland and the Irish border will come even higher up the agenda than it already was. I think both the UK and the European Union had agreed that Ireland will be a priority. Clearly, if you now have the UK government dependent on Northern Irish votes, that will become even more high up the agenda. Whether the DUP have a different interpretation of what they want from these talks, we'll have to see. The DUP leader has already commented that she doesn't want Northern Ireland to have any form of special status within the single market, because traditionally they want to stay close to the rest of the UK, although she's also said that Theresa May's position is probably untenable in the medium term, so we'll wait and see. But certainly for the rest of this talk, my assumption is that Brexit will happen. There might be, arguably, there might be more scope after the election for trade-offs and for negotiations on some of the individual points I'm going to be touching on. There may also be, and there certainly should be, a considerably more conciliatory and humble tone coming from London. I think had Theresa May come in with a big majority, I would have heard a lot about how she had the will of the people behind her. With the will of the people being rather more ambiguous, I think there might be a rather more nuanced tone in the negotiations. Right, back to the media sector. Just before we start, just a point of clarification. As Mark hinted, many international media companies are impacted by the decision to leave the European Union. Despite that, the broadcasting sector was strictly neutral during the referendum campaign. For obvious reasons, those parts of the industry which have news services are obliged by statute to be impartial. The BBC was particularly nervous given the rather overheated tone of the negotiation of the referendum debate. The BBC was bending over backwards to be impartial, and to make sure it gave exactly the same minutes to the Remain camp as to the Leave camp. With other big news providers, Sky and ITN, following the same strategy, it would have been rather odd for a company like Discovery, which has about 2% of the UK market, to be the ones who said, yes, we must remain in the single market. So all broadcasters in Europe remained strictly neutral in public. The creative sector, though, had a fairly obvious leaning towards the Remain camp. There was a survey carried out by the Creative Industries Federation, which is very wide. It covers broadcasting, filmmaking, architecture, design, etc. There's a survey of around 1,000 of its members which reported a 96% vote to remain in the European Union. So almost kind of like the sort of things you get in the presidential elections in Belarus, a very, very firm view from the creative industry that they wanted to remain in the EU. Maybe that plays into the stereotype of liberal metropolitan lovies, or maybe it was just that a number of us were reliant on EU funding and EU market access. Either way, I think there are basically 5 main areas where Brexit will impact on us in the broadcasting sector. Broadcasting, production, people and free movement, trade, and a couple of legal points, which are probably actually more important than many of the other ones for us in the future. Starting with broadcasting, the UK is far and away the market leader in terms of issuing broadcasting licenses. This is data from Mavis. It's not brand new. I think it's about 6 months old. So the UK licensing 3 times more channels than the number 2 in Europe, which is France. And particularly relevant for these purposes is that Ofcom licenses 650 channels for non-UK distribution, including several owned by Discovery. We talk a lot about the European Union. We should remember that a number of those licenses are actually for Council of Europe territories, so there are still quite a few functioning broadcasting licenses under the old convention. So yes, the advertising regime is the old one. They only apply to broadcasting, not to digital services. But between the Council Convention and the AVMS, there are 650 Ofcom licenses going out to mainland Europe. And in terms of the traffic coming the other way, I think there's about 50 in total. So the UK is clearly a mass exporter of broadcasting licenses. It's a growing part of Ofcom's business. 68% of their new licenses in the last 10 years have not been for UK services, but for European targeted services. What about the future of these licenses? The UK government's white paper that Lorna referred to has a rather aspirational comment, but they will aim for the best possible deal to secure continued access for EU markets for international channels. I'm personally rather sceptical about how much detailed work has been done on this. The Secretary of State for exiting the European Union was before the Brexit Select Committee in the Commons 2 weeks after that, and he spoke quite fluently about the banking sector and the equivalence and financial adequacy, and then said he thought that there could be a similar regime for broadcasting. The difference being that under financial legislation, there is already an equivalence regime. There's nothing like that for broadcasting, and as far as we know, there's nothing being proposed in the current AVMS review. The Secretary of State said in the end he would get back to the committee with a written answer rather than get further into the details. So clearly, and given that the government has taken the view that they want the relationship with the European Union to be on the basis of a free trade deal rather than single market access, the likelihood of Ofcom licenses remaining valid outside the UK in the medium term is not great. I mean, we look at this a lot internally, and you can speculate. Some days you might think there's a 25% chance, some days a 40% chance, but clearly the odds are rather stacked against us. But I do think that for most international broadcasting groups based in London, and pretty much all of them have some presence there, the question of how to fix the AVMS licensing is probably one of the more straightforward ones. We all have other centres, other hubs scattered around Europe. There is some clear case law about the need for editorial decisions to be taken in the place where you're licensed. It can be done with relatively minimal upheaval, we think. Just in passing, why so many international broadcasters are based in the UK. This was a bit of work carried out by the Commercial Broadcasters Association in London, Discovery is a member, as are all the other international players. Interestingly, apart from, so they were asking basically American companies who'd invested in London. Quite strangely, we only scored 8 out of 10 for our English language skills, but apart from that, the interesting point to me, at least, was yeah, the UK actually isn't really spectacularly good at anything on that list, but it's quite a good all-rounder. It doesn't have any weak points either. And I think if you were to model the same survey on, I don't know, a Scandinavian market or something, you might find that there were some 9s and 10s scattered around there, but maybe a 4 for size of local market or broadcast infrastructure or something like that. So that's why so many international players are based in London for now. So broadcasting, as I said, we regard as our problem, one we can fix with some internal moves. Production, I think, is perhaps of wider interest. Program making is now more international than it ever has been before. Basically, when European broadcasters first got into investment in drama and so on, the model was one of 100% financing. So ITV or Mediaset would simply pay for a series to be made, and they would recoup the money from the advertising sold in and around that program. That model is no longer sustainable because advertising budgets are coming under pressure, and also because the cost for making shows is going up all the time. I've referenced a couple there, Game of Thrones, with HBO investing, depending on who you believe and which series it is, up to $10 million an hour for an episode of Game of Thrones. Netflix recently put $100 million into The Crown. And there's some, when you talk to people that worked on that show, there's interesting anecdotes about how, a bridesmaid's dress, which is on screen for 2 minutes, costs $52,000 and all that sort of stuff. So it's a huge budgets. And those are budgets which are beyond the current ambitions of my employer, but clearly you don't want your program to look sort of cheap and shoddy next to Game of Thrones. So all budgets are moving up across the television sector. So what we're doing about it, we've looked over the fence and seen how our colleagues in the film sector have worked for many years. Film producers have always worked on the basis of pre-sales, so you sell the right to show a movie in the territory in advance before it's even made. They've also done co-productions across borders. They've also tapped into state aid and film financing. There's also been a certain degree of clustering around films, so Hollywood, Bollywood, etc. In the broadcasting sector, interestingly, the strongest cluster I'm aware of is actually in Turkey. Turkish soap operas, as some of you will know, are phenomenally popular throughout the Balkans, North Africa and the Middle East. And Turkey is actually still the second biggest exporter of television anywhere globally after the US. And it's done on it's a strategic industrial plan. There are studio complexes outside Istanbul that churn these things out 24 hours a day. So as a result, program making is more international than ever. This is a series called The Night Manager, which was a great critical and commercial success for the BBC in 2016. The point of the headline there, BAFTA is the British Academy of Film and Television Arts. Confusing, it's also a bold and ambitious free trade agreement, which we might talk about later. but this BAFTA is like a kind of UK Oscars, if you like. And the Night Manager, which had been the runaway hit for the BBC, was the clear favourite for winning the Best British Programme, until BAFTA looked into the rules and found out it didn't qualify as British. Because all the criteria you had, yes, the BBC were involved in the financing of it, but only to about 25%. It's the adaptation of a John le Carré novel, for those that aren't familiar with it. There was US money in there, the principal director was Danish, etc., etc. So in the end, BAFTA actually had to change their rules so this programme could qualify, because it would have been absurd not to have awarded it the Best British Programme for that year. So a very global part of the sector, anything to do with programme making. I think in contrast to broadcasting, there is a strong mutual interest, though, between the UK and the other European states to get this right. From a UK perspective, Lorna's already touched on this, very important that we retain European status for UK-originated content for quotas. So if you are exporting shows, particularly to France, but other places as well, very important you have that tick to say this qualifies for your European quota. Under AVMS, as Lorna says, we're okay because the definition is not EU, it's Council of Europe. There is, however, a snag that AVMS also then requires that if you are a non-EU member state with your quota count, with your content counting for the European quota, you have to not be taking discriminatory action against EU players. And frankly, in the machinery of government, there are some in the Department of Trade in particular who think, well, let's go out and strike a great big deal with the Americans. And certainly in the broadcasting sector, we're very keen that the Department of Culture, Media and Sport take on board the fact that we could have a great deal with the Americans, allowing them privileged access to our markets, and suddenly find we're discriminating against European content, and therefore our stuff is no longer qualifying for European quotas. So it's a complicated area, but certainly that is one of the things which all parts of the sector are very keen to get right. If you can imagine the impact on the BBC, ITV, or the big independent producers if suddenly they found half of their content wasn't qualifying for EU quotas. We in the sector would like to see the UK ask for access to Creative Europe funding to the media programme. It's legally possible. You don't need to be an EU member state. Serbia, I think, is already the most recent country to accede to the Creative Europe scheme. Switzerland has done so in the past. Our concern is rather, if you're in this environment where the relationship with the EU is much more transactional, if you look at it on a pure cost-benefit basis, the UK would pay in more to Creative Europe than it has taken out in the past 2 or 3 years, Creative Europe financing. But we're optimistic about the production side because there's a lot of mutual interest here. Zodiac Productions and Canal Plus, for example, have filmed Versailles in English because they wanted an eye on the export market. And for that, they need access to the UK market, UK talent, etc. So we think we can find a solution in co-production that works. The most sensitive one, perhaps internally, is around people and talent. Depending on which company you ask, between 20 and 30% of the workforce in a London television company is European but not UK. In some teams, it's much higher than that. I spoke to the guy who runs our digital project the other week. He's got one UK citizen working for him. And that's it, because that is a completely global world. And if you want the best person, you'll typically hire someone that's worked on Hulu or Netflix. So there's a lot of Americans there as well. This is yet another area where the government hasn't yet shown its cards to industry, let alone to the rest of the European Union. So we only have scant information about what they actually want or what their thinking is. There was a lot of talk in the referendum campaign around an Australian-style points-based visa system and what have you. That seems to have gone away. And certainly we in the rest of the creative sector are asking if it's going to be an immigration system based on skills. You have to accept that there's a lot of freelancing in our sector, which can be beneficial for the freelancers, but not necessarily easy to get through a migration scheme. If a channel is launching, and you're launching a new channel in Bulgaria under an Ofcom license, because that's where your headquarters are, you will have people coming in for 2 weeks to do some voiceovers. There isn't a payroll, there isn't a Department of Bulgarian language anywhere in a broadcaster, but they will bring people in on short-term contracts, and the people will work at Discovery for 10 days, then they might take a few days off, go and work at Viacom for a week, go and work somewhere else. That's, in a way, that's the employment patterns that we've been told to adopt, right? It's flexible, modern, high-tech. But how we fit this into this new regime where freedom of movement is going to be constrained is going to be very, very complex. But not as complex as trade. The mantra of global Britain has been resuscitated. It was actually the name of a far-right think tank in the 1990s, but this is now a bit more respectable. And this bold and ambitious free trade agreement is something you hear a lot in London at the moment. Again, we're a bit sketchy on what the details are, but there seems to be a view that the UK has about 44% of its trade is with the EU at the moment. That figure is it's increasing, but as an absolute percentage, it's not increasing as fast as it is with the rest of the world, obviously because you've had growth in places like China and India. And the view seems to be that the UK economy can pivot towards some of these faster growing economies. I say here there's a plea for help from the audiovisual sector. Anybody in private practice here who wants to specialise in an area, I don't know anyone in the TV and film sector who actually knows anything at all about trade. I mean, Lorna's presentation was very good, but TISA and MFN and commitments and schedules is a foreign language to, not just to me, but to everyone in the sector. For the very simple reason that the exception culturelle, the view most strongly held by France, but by other European countries as well, that film and TV are kept out of trade talks has been the default position in our sector for 25 or 30 years. So other people talk about trade deals, and we kind of don't listen to that part of the meeting. So we do have a lot of catching up to do, also internally, because do you as a broadcaster have offensive interests in trade talks? In my previous role, the European Commission asked us that question. Do you as broadcasters have offensive interests in the US with TTIP? And frankly, the answer was, no, we don't particularly. The only regulatory barrier between European and US broadcasting was the old FCC rule. You had to be a US player to own one of the three main networks. But given that they were all, all fairly securely owned by local players anyway, they weren't coming on the market, and if they were, nobody could afford them. And by contrast, in production, there were no barriers at all. If you want sort of a production affiliate in the US, you go and do it. So we have, as a sector, struggled to find offensive interests that we think are reasonably achievable. I say reasonably achievable because, as a global company, Discovery has had problems in the recent past in Russia, where there was a change in legislation which basically said that anybody who wasn't Russian had to leave the market. I think you're allowed a 20% share in a JV. We've had issues in Turkey, where, although in theory a license from a Council of Europe member state is good for going into Turkey, in practice the regulator doesn't like that. And many media companies have had issues in China. The difficulty is, of course, the scale and the political complexity of sorting these problems out are rather a different magnitude from what we think is the scope and of the ambition of the officials at the DCMS and the Department of Trade in London. So, yes, it would be nice to think that the UK could reopen the Russian market for us. But frankly, I mean, that is obviously such a sort of political level decision that we don't expect. We're not really expecting that. As I said before, I think this is an area where broadcasting and production may well be split, and there may be some wins we can make in the production business, particularly because of the timelines here. It's only recently becoming apparent to some politicians, but it's hard to see any free trade deal, let alone a bold and ambitious one, being signed and ratified much before 2022. So if you want to have something on a shorter term, the sort of things we could look at would be co-production treaties. Some of the UK's bilateral film co-production treaties are already open to television production. We think that's probably a more reasonable ask to government than to go and talk about revamping Russian media ownership laws. I'm conscious throughout this presentation, because there's very little is clear about Brexit, that there hasn't been much legal detail. So here's a couple of points that have occurred to us. I mean, clearly, Brexit will bring about change and restructuring. The reaction of most senior managers to that is, well, it's another one of the massive issues we have to deal with, alongside changing consumer patterns, new competition, new technology, and then we've got Brexit on the regulatory side as well. So there's no particular complaint from that side. But I do think for the UK as a country, there is a need to kind of think a little bit beyond the immediate. So it's a horrible cliche, but Brexit it's not an event, it's a process. And once you have, as many companies now have, management consultants in the CEO's office showing plans and charts and stuff, it's a process that will continue. For example, like most media companies, Discovery is looking actively into ways to monetize consumer, or to have a direct relationship with consumers on a kind of Netflix-style model. I think everyone has a plan along those lines at the moment. Okay, you think, well, that's fine. So you base that on, so you collect the credit card data of the individual and you sell them a subscription. But as soon as you're doing that, you're into transfrontier data protection and data privacy regulation. And yes, the UK will, in the Great Repeal Act that Lorna talked about, the UK will bring the GDPR into UK law, but how does it keep pace with, I mean, let's face it, the GDPR will be litigated. The European Court will be called upon to comment on the GDPR. How does the UK keep pace with that? Yes, March 2019, we're fine, we're compliant. 3 years down the line, it's looking a bit more questionable. And obviously for us, as a US headquartered company, the EU-US Privacy Shield is very important as well. So trying to find a mechanism to keep up to date with that, which is currently, I think, reviewed annually by the Department of Commerce and the European Commission. Yeah, the consequence, if the UK doesn't get this right, the consequence will be no one's going to leave the UK altogether, right? Of course, we're going to keep an office there, we've got our global headquarters there, but the threat, rather, is that the new innovative stuff, which relies on personal data, will be based elsewhere. So, which is not good news for the UK as a company. The other example, quite a topical one, is Europol's work on intellectual property. There's a case about 6 weeks ago where Europol launched simultaneous raids and arrest warrants and seizures to an IPTV pirate ring in Denmark, Bulgaria, Spain, and the UK. Now, we've made the point, actually, fortunately, the Labour Party Brexit spokesman is Keir Starmer, who's a former director of public prosecution, so he gets the Europol system. He knows it, he thinks it works well. And we've made the point to him that, if and when he's ever in the negotiations, that's a fairly critical ask, not just for us, and there was actually a Sky case, not a Discovery case, but for the UK content sector as a whole, to have active participation, because piracy networks aren't local. They cross frontiers, and the more we can do that, the better. The problem, of course, as you will have spotted, is that there are, certainly in the previous government, there was an in-principle objection to the jurisdiction of the European Court. This slogan about taking back control of our money, our borders, and our laws was repeated throughout the referendum campaign and beyond. And I think the task for us in the industry is to try and persuade government that actually there are some things where it's very much in our interests as operators and also in their interests as people trying to grow the economy for the UK to have some form of relationship or affiliate status or whatever you call it at the European Court. It's going to be very complicated, but then pretty much everything to do with Brexit is rather complicated. Lauren's already covered this one about the methodology and the transfer of European law into UK law. AVMS is an obvious stumbling block because, as we understand the timings, the Great Repeal Bill will actually be halfway through the UK Parliament when the co-legislators here adopt the new AVMS. So apparently there is a mechanism, or at least DCMS and Ofcom are keen to have a mechanism which will allow the Great Repeal Bill to kind of shape shift as it goes through the UK Parliament. So on day one, it's basically incorporating these 1,000 statutes or whatever it is, but will then incorporate other ones, other pieces of EU legislation as they are adopted. There's also a huge amount of technical work to be done. Ofcom told me there were over 1,000 references to the phrase "another member state." So in order for that to make sense, yes, you can do a lot of that by statutory instruments, as Lorna was explaining, but there is a feeling of, not frustration, because the civil servants understand there was a referendum and a decision, but a feeling of being slightly daunted by the workload that needs to be undertaken just to get us back to the status quo before we even start thinking about the future model and the future trade deals and so on. That's the end of my 20 minutes, which I think I overran slightly. So a final comment on this. It's often said that business doesn't like uncertainty. I'm not sure that's necessarily true, actually, because most CEOs actually thrive on having a new competitor in town or having a new way to do business and these sort of uncertainties. I think the real challenge around Brexit is that there are layers and layers of uncertainty. And yes, you can say to your board, we're fine until March 2019, and then there might be a transitional deal, or there might not, and it just and then it depends what's in the transitional deal. Will the audiovisual sector be in it or not? There are so many ifs, which kind of layer on top of each other, all of which will only be answered when the negotiations are either completed or fall apart in an acrimonious manner. It is quite a challenge for media businesses to see their way through. I mean, I'm confident in 5 years' time there will be we'll have it all sorted out, but it's taking a long time to do. And it's, well, as I said, it's not a single event. It's a long process, and one that will see some considerable reshaping and restructuring of our businesses and our sector. Okay, that was it. Thanks.
Thank you very much.